Hi everyone, I'm Stan Mallow. Welcome to Paranormal Yakker. My guest today is best-selling author Troy Taylor, and he's also the founder of American Hauntings, Inc., which offers books, events, and ghost tours, owns the American Oddities Museum in Alton, Illinois, and is a writer and co-host of the American Hauntings podcast. I'll be talking with Troy about his book, The Devil Came to St. Louis, which is the uncensored true story of a 1949 exorcism that took place in St. Louis and made worldwide headlines. It's currently under option to be turned into a film by a major production company. I wish you luck on that. Troy Taylor, welcome to Paranormal Yakker.
Thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to it.
The movie The Exorcist was based on the book with the same title, written by William Peter Blatty. To this day, it's considered one of the scariest movies ever made. Your book, The Devil Came to St. Louis, explores in detail the real life case that inspired the book and the movie. You, Troy, are a supernatural historian and researched the demonic possession of the child you write about for over 20 years. What was there about the case that so enthralled you that it resulted in you devoting such an incredible amount of your time and energy to it?
I've been fascinated with The Exorcist anyway. It's a great film, and I'd read the book when I was quite young, younger than I probably should have. But I have always enjoyed it so much. And I live right across the river from St. Louis in Illinois. It's where I didn't grow up here, but I've been here quite a while. And so when I sort of started to find that there was a real story that had happened in St. Louis. It didn't start out there. It started out in Maryland, actually a suburb of DC called Cottage City. That's where it started, but the family was from St. Louis. All their relatives were in St. Louis. And I got interested in the story knowing that it had happened there and really just sort of went on a little my own guided tour of some of the places that were still around, and including the home where relatives of the family had lived. This is where they came to stay when they left Maryland and decided maybe going to St. Louis might help with some of the problems they were running into. And they thought, well, let's try St. Louis, where we're from. So I went to the house. It was empty at the time. And I started to find that had been sort of common thing for a number of years. There hadn't been a lot of people living in it. The last person who had lived in it before I had gone there had only lived there for a month before they moved out. These are the kind of breadcrumbs you like about a story. So I started digging into the history of that house, really found the family's name. This would have been back in the late 90s. This was before anybody had any idea what his name was or anything like that. He'd always just been called Roland Doe. That was the name that the Catholic Church had given him to hide his identity. And by finding out that the family that lived in that home, their name was Hunkeler, it wasn't hard for me to go to Cottage City, Maryland, and find the Hunkeler home and find out the name of the boy who had been allegedly possessed back in 1949. So I just kind of went with the idea that I wanted to make sure that his privacy was protected. And eventually, when I did an interview with him, that was on the condition that it would continue to be protected as long as he was alive. The reason I use it now is because he passed away from a stroke in May of 2020. So it's been almost 5 years now. I put up a new edition of the book that could put in all the things that I couldn't put in before. I just gotten started out of curiosity. Honestly, that's what drew me to the story in the first place. And I just kind of went from there, and it took on a life of its own.
While the actual exorcism of the demon who possessed Ronald Hunkeler, I don't know if I say his last name again, Hunkeler?
Hunkeler, yes.
Hunkeler, okay, I'm close to it, Hunkeler.
Yeah.
The young boy who is the central figure in your book took place in St. Louis, Missouri. The events that led up to it has its roots, as you just said, in a house he lived in Cottage City, Maryland. Can you, Troy, tell me about some of those events that happened in the Maryland home?
It was started out January 15th, 1949. The family were able to nail it down to that's kind of when things began. And that was with just kind of odds and ends noises, tapping, strange sounds, scratching noises. Originally, Ronnie's father, Edwin, thought that maybe they had a mice infestation or something. Brought in an exterminator, couldn't find anything. And then things sort of progressed from there. And they all seemed to kind of center around Ronald. The noises seemed to be in his room, under his floor. The sheets were being pulled off his bed. His bed was moving by itself, rocking, banging against the wall, would roll out across the middle of the floor. Things started happening at school, around the house. And these were things that were witnessed by not just the immediate family, but also Ronald lived there with his father, his mother, and his grandmother. And they were seeing these things, but so were friends, neighbors, relatives who were visiting. They were seeing these same things happening. It wasn't isolated to just the family. And then when it happened at school with a desk one day that just sort of moved across the floor by itself, teachers became upset thinking that it was Ronald playing a prank. One of his friends that I interviewed who was there in the class that day swore to me that Ronald's feet were not even on the floor. He saw the desk move. Well, the family, not knowing what else to do, decided to contact their minister, who was a Lutheran. Edwin, and it gets complicated a bit. Edwin was a Catholic. The family had all been Catholics, but Ronald's grandmother, Anna, had converted to be a Lutheran many years before, and had raised Ronald's mother that way and had raised Ronald that way. So they contacted their Lutheran minister, explained to him what was going on. He didn't really take it very seriously because he just assumed that it was probably Ronnie playing pranks on his family. He did ask that Ronnie be checked out by mental health and physical health specialists, make sure there was nothing wrong with him. And he was there at the house. He witnessed some of the things that were going on, but even then he still wasn't convinced. So he taking Ronnie kind of out of his comfort zone, took him over to his house for the night, and actually saw not only the bed move, but saw a chair move that Ronnie was sitting in that Ronnie couldn't have moved, and even saw a pallet that Ronnie was lying on the floor move all the way across the room while Ronnie was asleep. So he never did believe that it was something demonic. He never thought it was a possession or even an infestation. He thought that it was simply poltergeist activity, that it was being caused by Ronnie. In fact, he had a correspondence with J.B. Rhine at Duke University, who at that point was really specializing in testing for ESP and for psychokinesis. And he believed he had a genuine case for him to examine. But by the time Dr. Rhine was able to get to Cottage City, the family was already in St. Louis. But it would be Reverend Schultz, that was his name, the Lutheran minister. It would be him that plays a major part in the story, because even though he never believed in the possession, he did believe that it was a poltergeist event. And he wrote a paper on it and presented it to a group in Washington, D.C. in August of 49, and mentioned that the boy had gone to St. Louis for an exorcism that had been successful. And the exorcism part is what really got the attention of the reporters that were there. And so they wrote it up in the paper. And for the next several days, every paper in DC had a story about a poltergeist and an exorcism, even though no one knew anything because no one was talking and it had been kept secret. But it was those newspaper clippings that William Peter Blatty had picked up. He was a seminary student at Georgetown at the time. And when he saw it, he went to his advisor and asked him about it. And his advisor said, "Oh, yeah, I'd heard about this, but I can't tell you any details because it's all kept very quiet." And that's what would later, 20 years later, spur his interest in writing The Exorcist. So those events in Maryland, while not what I would call part of the beginning stages of what became a possession, not as important as what happened in St. Louis, but without it, we probably wouldn't be telling the story that we are. But the family then did decide to pack up and go to St. Louis after an incident occurred in the house one night when Ronald was in bed. His mother was in the kitchen of the house on the opposite side of the house talking to a friend and explaining that they were thinking about going to see relatives in St. Louis. And at the same time they were having this discussion, according to the family, there were scratched lines that appeared on Ronnie's body. Now, this had happened before, but in this particular case, the lines, the words, had spelled out Louis. And so they took that as a sign, and that's how they ended up in St. Louis.
In an effort to remove her son from the negative environment that was manifesting itself in Maryland, in their Maryland home, Ronald's mother, Odell, moved the family to St. Louis. As you had said, were any other places considered, or St. Louis was the place she wanted to take her son?
I think St. Louis, that's where her and Edwin had met. That's where her parents were from. All their family was there. Aunts, uncles, everybody was in St. Louis. And so it wasn't so much that they thought, well, we could get help in St. Louis. It was that maybe we could leave this behind and go somewhere where, because at this point, while unnerving, it wasn't anything particularly scary or violent. It was just very strange. I mean, it wouldn't start to get more frightening until they got to St. Louis and were staying with Edwin's brother and sister-in-law, Leonard and Doris Hunkeler, right in a kind of a suburb of St. Louis. And once they got there, things started to get worse instead of better.
Whatever demon possessed Ronald in Maryland remained with him in his family's move to St. Louis. Obviously, his mother realized that moving her son to a different location did not change anything. He was still being possessed by a negative entity.
The activity that was going on at the time really didn't qualify for an exorcism. Technically, it couldn't have been a possession at that point because Ronnie, a lot of the things that are needed for an official exorcism had not happened yet. They eventually, most of them would. But I think what happened is that the family was getting very scared because things were moving around, banging around at night. Ronald was having these terrible nightmares, were terrifying the entire family with all the screams. And it was a lot of stuff that priests today who specialize in exorcisms would call an infestation. In other words, there was something there following Ronald around, trying to get inside of him. And their thought most likely was to try and stop this. Again, initially, when the family got frightened, one of the oldest daughter, Ronnie's cousin, Janice, went to see her advisor at St. Louis University. And his name was Father Raymond Bishop. He was a Jesuit priest. And he had come out to the house to pray with Ronnie, to bless Ronnie, and to see what was going on. And then he witnessed the bed shaking on its own. And it only stopped after he splashed it with holy water. And I think that here's a guy, it's 1949, St. Louis, Missouri, Jesuit priest, but with zero experience when it came to possession or exorcism or anything else. I don't really know that he had any idea of what to do. He went to see a friend of his, slightly older, or more of a mentor, who was William Bowdern, who was another Jesuit priest. And they went back together. And then what they saw, they went to the Archbishop to tell them what they'd seen. Again, not enough to qualify for an exorcism, but certainly to invoke ritual prayers to get rid of this infestation. Even though neither man had any experience whatsoever in exorcisms or possessions or with demons or anything else, they had to do kind of a crash course so that they could take care of this and try to handle this. And which had to be, again, without much information to go by at the time, pretty frightening. They were also told they have to keep it a secret because, well, it wasn't because the church was embarrassed or while it might have brought upset to the family, they wanted to do it because at that particular moment, St. Louis was in the middle of a real kind of political upheaval involving the church. They were trying to desegregate all of the Catholic churches and schools in the city, and they've taken a lot of flack for this. So Archbishop Joseph Ritter was concerned that this would look bad to the enemies of the church. They're in the middle of doing a medieval ritual. Should we be trusting these people with modern ideas about civil rights if they're doing things with medieval rituals? So they decided to keep the whole thing very, very quiet. They couldn't talk about where they were, what was happening. One of the reasons they chose to use the name Roland Doe to hide Ronnie's and his family's identity. The actual exorcism began March 16th of 1949, and things got progressively worse from there.
What were some of the procedures and rituals performed on Ronald to exorcise the demon that was possessing him?
It was fairly standard as far as, I mean, there is a ritual that is used for exorcism, a specific prayer found in the Ritual Romananum. And so they would come and each night, and again, they had to do it at night, not for anything spooky. It's just that's the only time that the two priests and their assistant, a man who named Walter Halloran, who at that time was just a kind of a student priest. They brought him along. He was a big, strong guy who they thought they might need help to hold Ronnie down because they knew things could be violent sometimes. And they would come each night and they would conduct the exorcism. And sometimes things would go smoothly. Most of the time they wouldn't. Once the exorcism began, Ronnie would begin to act out. And that was everything from violent contortions to seizures to screaming, howling, singing, barking like a dog, saying horrible things, using different voices. There's a reason that you see all these things in the movies is because it really happened. And now they're adapting that for film because a lot of the things that you see in a movie like The Exorcist did happen. Not all of it was quite so dramatic, but there were reports even of levitations, nothing like up to the ceiling, but Ronnie's body leaving the bed and the throes of the exorcism, things like that. And a lot of it just was very difficult to explain. Their assistant, Walt Halloran, I interviewed him toward the end of his life and quite got to know him, spent quite a lot of time with him. And he really filled in a lot of holes for me on the things that were happening because Father Bishop was hoping to write kind of a book or a manual about how to do an exorcism because there hadn't been any recent material. So he wrote everything down in a diary, but he just made notes. He was going to flesh it out later into a book, which he never did. Having Father Halloran there to be able to fill in some of the holes. And plus there were things that Father Bishop didn't want to write down because they were just so vile and so obscene that they're not in writing. It's hard to know exactly what happened without talking to the witnesses. And unfortunately, there's none left. I interviewed every living witness to the exorcism, and there just aren't any more. They're all gone now.
In the movie The Exorcist, there were a number of disturbing scenes, which you spoke about. This included the head of the possessed child spinning, bed shaking, levitation, which you said did happen, vomiting a green pea-like slime on a priest, and a crucifix stabbing. Did any of that really happen in the actual exorcism case you researched?
There's a little bit. Those things for the movie were exaggerated a little bit for film, but this isn't the only case that Blatty used as an inspiration. There was one that had taken place back in the 1920s in Iowa, which was even wilder. The accounts are not nearly as thorough, but they're much wilder. And it's lots of stuff of vomiting, all kinds of things. Now, in Ronald's case, there was the screaming, there was the violence, there was the objects moving, the bed moving off the floor. Several people spoke of that. I had a witness who was an Alexian monk who was there toward the end of the exorcism when they were at the Alexian Brothers Hospital in St. Louis. And he swore to me repeatedly that he saw Ronald levitate 12 inches off the bed. Swore to me. I can't find any reason why he'd lie. It's an Alexian brother who'd spent his entire life just in service to other people who wanted to tell his story of what he'd seen. I wouldn't call it vomiting as much as I would call it the spitting, but it wasn't just spit. It was more of like a thick bile. But according to Father Halloran, they would do everything they could to try to prevent Ronnie from spitting it at Father Bowdern as he was reading the exorcism ritual, which seemed to be his target. And yet, from 6, 7, 8, 10 feet away, he had amazing accuracy. I mean, they would hold up towels to try to protect him, to try to shield him. Somehow Ronnie could get around it. And according to Father Halloran, the most shocking part of all that was the fact that Ronald was doing it with his eyes closed. Now, he couldn't figure that one out, how he just was able to sense where Father Bowdern was. Yes, some of the things that you see in the book or in the movie did allegedly occur. That, as far as all the records say, they happened. A lot of it was show business, but there was enough there that I think that probably this was an exhausting and very frightening thing that these guys were doing. And it lasted for 6 weeks. And that's a pretty awful way to spend every night for 6 weeks for Ronnie and for the priests.
In your research for The Devil Came to St. Louis, how, Troy, did you go about separating fact from fiction, deciding who was telling you the truth from those who embellished what they witnessed and those who said outright lies about what happened because they wanted their 5 or 10 minutes of fame?
The biggest problem I had was a story that actually happened in Maryland that claimed that a Catholic priest there actually carried out the first exorcism and was injured and all these terrible things that had happened. The more I dug into it, the more research I did, and it sounded off because for one thing, you can't just show up somewhere and do an exorcism without permission. And then it turned out that once I actually did a little research, got into the diaries that Father Bishop left behind, he mentioned that this Catholic priest about whom this story had been told never even met Ronnie Hunkeler. They never actually met. So he couldn't have done it and couldn't have been injured or anything else. And I even went to the church where he had been posted at the time and spoke to the current pastor there. And he and I went through the records that showed that while he was supposedly injured and getting medical and psychiatric treatment, that he'd been busy at the church the entire time. He'd never taken a break. He'd done something like 52 baptisms and funerals and christenings during a time when he was supposed to have been in a mental hospital. Well, it turned out that that story gotten started after he'd passed away by one of his old assistant pastors who saw his chance for 15 minutes of fame of telling this story. And so moving forward, a lot of it, I had to depend on the written records that I had. Luckily, I had some, and I had the names and were able to connect with the witnesses who were still alive, who'd actually been there. And while sometimes with some witnesses, you have to be careful, you got to take it with a grain of salt. Even by that time, I'd been doing it long enough to know who makes a decent witness and who doesn't. So I didn't get a lot of my leg being pulled by priests. I have run into a few, let's just say, religiously affiliated individuals who like to tell you stories of what they heard on campus or what they heard around that isn't necessarily true. But so far, all of them have been great when I've said, well, here's the thing, here's the record, and here's what this priest who was actually there says. And they usually all get oh, okay, well, I guess we've been, hearing the wrong thing. So you do run into that. And it is a lot of separating fact from fiction, because back in the 70s, when hints started to come around after the movie came out that this was based on a real case, it was very difficult to get solid information. So people did tend to just sort of make things up and embellish whatever they could. You have to take a lot of that stuff from the mid 70s and look at it with a really critical eye and talk to the people. And it helps when you can talk to people who were actually there and who were actually alive. The worst person I probably interviewed was Ronnie himself, only because, and this was something that was going on during the exorcism, when they would go through the rituals at night and Ronnie would turn into this monster. During the day, he was fine. He actually, for the most part, until the end, acted normal and didn't remember what had happened to him the night before. Now, I don't know if it was his brain shielding him from something or if there was something God shielding him from it. I don't know. But he had very little memory. Even when I spoke to him, he knew he'd spent his whole life as the exorcist boy. When he graduated college, he went to work for NASA. And he worked for NASA until he retired in 2001. And he was always afraid that his coworkers were going to find out that he was the kid that inspired The Exorcist, but they never did. He had plenty of stories to tell. He just couldn't give me a lot of firsthand story about what happened during the exorcism because he just didn't remember most of it.
How, Troy, did the possessed boy Ronald live out his life after having the demon that possessed him released? And what effect did the ordeal he endured as a child have on him as an adult?
That's a good question. I will tell you that while the exorcism was going on, Ronald was studying the catechism and was baptized. He did convert to becoming a Catholic, not surprisingly, when this was over. In fact, his entire family returned to Catholicism. So he remained a Catholic his entire life. He went to Catholic high school. He graduated from college. He had a degree in engineering and one in psychology, interesting enough. He said he did go to work for NASA. That was his entire career. He got a patent for a insulating material they use on rockets they still use to this day that keeps them from burning up when they come back into the Earth's atmosphere. But for the most part, he stayed out of the limelight. He knew who he'd been, he knew the reputation, but he kind of had always later told me that when Halloween came, he would always leave home because he was always afraid like a news crew or something would show up at his house. And he didn't really worry about it too much until the internet came along. And then when his name started to leak out there a little bit, he did get a little concerned. No one ever really confronted him. I said, I did an interview with him and he was great, a really nice guy. There just wasn't a whole lot he could tell me other than things that he remembered as far as what his life had been like after the exorcism, which was honestly pretty normal. Married, had kids, grandkids, just a pretty ordinary guy with this weird incident in his past.
Should viewers of Paranormal Yakker want to purchase your book, The Devil Came to St. Louis, learn about other books you've authored, your American Oddities Museum, Alton Hauntings and Ghost Tours, and the American Haunting podcast you co-host, how, Troy, can they do that?
Best way to do it is just go to americanhauntings.net, and that'll get you everywhere you need to go.
Great. I'm sure a lot of people will be going on that. Troy Taylor, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yakker. It was great yakking with you, and I look forward to interviewing you in the future about your ghost tours and museum.
Sounds great. Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yakker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. So that you don't miss any upcoming shows, be sure to subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, just press the subscribe button on your screen.